Warwick, welcome. So good to have you here. I'm going to jump right into some questions for you. Your story is a big story, and it's almost like a movie could be made from this. I listened to a podcast you were on again last night, and I literally think they should make a movie. And I think the opening scene could be that elevator ride that you took. So talk to me a little bit about that elevator ride. And by the way, welcome to the Leaders Lab. Good to have you here.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Ken, for having me. And yeah, I appreciate it. So,
Of course.
yeah, that elevator ride, it was December 1987. I was just turned 27, I guess, at the time. And I had just completed a $2.25 billion takeover of my family's media company, 150-year-old company in Australia. So as these deals take a while to consummate. You got to get a certain amount of shares, and so we got what we needed. And so I'd walked into uh, the lobby of the company, John Fairfax Limited. It's a very large company, and I walked into that elevator, into the lobby, and then into the elevator. And in that moment, I was so uncomfortable. Um, Everybody knew who I was. I mean, my face had been in the TV media for months as leading up to this takeover. And there were journalists and other staff members. They didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. It was just this silence. And I guess in that moment, I had this thought of, I really don't want to be here. And certainly at the time, I was somewhat of a shy, reserved, retiring person. And yes, I was full of idealism and determination, but sometimes you have an objective and you achieve it. And it's like, did I really want this? The thrill of the chase, the thrill of the deal, if you will. Um, and so mercifully that elevator ride ended. And just to give folks a bit of background on why this was such a big deal, uh, I grew up in this 150-year-old family media company, and it had TV stations, newspapers, magazines, radio newsprint mills. It had the Australian equivalent of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, 4,000 plus employees, major papers, mentioned Sydney, Melbourne, the daily national paper. So it was a big deal. And so I got off the elevator and walked into this wood paneled boardroom, and it's pretty much right out of central casting. If you can imagine some old line family
Literally in
company.
literally in my head, I'm thinking like Michael Douglas walks into this, like I'm
Yeah,
thinking of from like Wall Street or something, right?
yeah, exactly. It's that kind of thing. And so on one side of the table was the old board, including some members of my family. On the other side of the table and my new board. Obviously, how you gain control of a company is through the shares, but then ultimately through the board. But then, lining the walls of that boardroom were paintings of my ancestors going back 5 generations. So, going back to the fifth generation, you had the founder, John Fairfax, and then his son, Sir James Redding Fairfax, his son, Sir James Oswald Fairfax, and then my father, same name as me, Sir Warwick Fairfax. Um, and I guess in that moment, as I was looking at those paintings and they were looking at me, I figured maybe they're thinking, what is this kid doing? He's just destroying 150 years. Why is he doing this takeover? And obviously I had my reasons, but in that moment, I'm wondering, what's this kid doing? And so I got control, but is this something that I really wanted? I had my reasons, but yeah, it was a pivotal moment in which, yes, I was now in control, but is this something that I really wanted? So yeah,
Is
it
that
wasn't exactly a joyous moment. It was a conflicted moment, put it that way.
is that where the term Crucible experience came from? Like I know that's what your book is titled. Like where did that where did that come from for you? Where is that moment for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. So really, it was sort of a crucible upbringing, if you will, because growing up I grew up with about as much money and privilege as you can have. Um, but when you grow up in a wealthy business, I guess you have one of two tracks. One is you can say, yep, I'm just going to live the good life, the fast cars, the partying, the substance abuse, which often goes with kids of wealthy backgrounds. It's kind of normal, I suppose. And then there's the other track, which is I always worked hard, got good grades. I wanted to be treated like everybody else. And Australia's a pretty egalitarian place, which is good. But, it wasn't like the kids in my somewhat elite private school were like, oh, wasn't so much respect. It's like, oh, just because you have a lot of money, you think you're better than us. And I said, well, no. So it's a very egalitarian ethos in Australia, which is good. But so I guess the crucible was that I always felt like I had no choice. It's a bit like growing up in the royal family. It sounds a weird analogy, but be like Prince William, who's now the heir apparent to King Charles. I mean, if he said to his dad or when his grandmother was alive, I don't really want to do this, like,
Right.
Prince Harry did, it's just not an option. You're letting
Right.
down your country. It really felt that way. So, I did my undergrad degree at Oxford and
Were there were
worked on
there
Wall Street, Harvard Business School. Yeah,
were there other choices like within the family, or because it really, I have heard you talk about this before, and it was almost like from the minute you were born, it was like, well, this is what you're destined for, like you're saying, almost like a prince to a king, right? And so
right.
did you have other siblings? Were there other, were there cousins? Were there like, or was it just
Yeah,
always going to
yeah.
be you?
Well, it's sort of yes to both, which is a bit of a contradiction, right? There were other options, but yes, it was going to be me,
Right.
at least from my parents' perspective. So I had an elder half brother. I was from my dad's third marriage. He was in his late 50s when I was born. He died in early 87, which kind of partly, well, significantly precipitated, he was in his late 80s at the time, and precipitated the whole takeover. But yeah, I had an elder half brother and cousin that were involved in the family business. But my dad and my parents felt like I was the next, the heir apparent. Without getting into all the weeds, my older half brother never married, and so basically the bulk of his shares, which he inherited from my father's shares, one day I was going to be the largest shareholder amongst the family. So from a shares perspective and my parents' desires, is that what everybody else in the family wanted? Well, maybe not everybody, maybe some,
At that point, it
had
doesn't
different
matter. It's
thoughts, but
more about leverage at that point. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it was a likely scenario that if I'd done nothing, it would have taken a few decades, but eventually, potentially, I would have been in a controlling position. So I definitely felt like that was my destiny, and it wasn't this pie in the sky thing. It was likely. So I just my whole life prepared myself to go into it. But one other just bit of background is anybody that's been in a family business, and I imagine there's quite a few listeners that have been, there's a lot of instability. So there'd been infighting in my family for decades between, different branches. Some other family members threw out my dad as chairman 11 years before in 1976, because it was sort of 2 against 1 in terms of the major blocks of the shares, which at age 15, at least subconsciously, was pretty devastating. So there was a cauldron of conflict and crucibles that I grew up in. So yeah, it was always the sense too that if I ever made a mistake growing up, like, I don't know, DUI, or did something stupid with a car, it'd be on the front page of the paper. I mean, so you
Right.
just couldn't afford to make a mistake, because
Well, I got to
then,
think in
how does
that
it look for my parents?
yeah, and I got to think in that situation that the media, whether we like it or not, I, I feel like I'm even kind of wired that way in a way, right? You see someone that's 23 years old, they've got in your mind, they've got the world by the tail, they've got all the money they want, they're running a $2 billion company. You're almost like, yeah, I knew he was going to screw up, right? Like the minute they get a DUI or the minute they take drugs and get caught
Right,
or whatever it is, even
right.
though those are fairly normal things to do. I certainly did them in my late teens and early 20s. So did you get a lot of heat from the media? Like, were they on you during this time frame? Were they kind of rooting for your demise in a way?
Um, I wasn't in the papers too much until I did the takeover.
Right.
Then I was in the papers a lot, and our own papers, the Sydney Morning Herald, were particularly savage. And we've always believed, unlike some other media, families and moguls and editorial independence. So, it sounds weird, but even when I was in control, I didn't silence, the editorial cartoons about me, for instance, which were really savage. I mean, there was one that had me dressed up as this like Mongol raider like Genghis Khan, and young Warwick, as they used to call me, because my dad was Sir Warwick, young Warwick and his horde of folks destroyed in a day what took 100 years to build. And there was another one, which is how do you start a small business? Give Warwick Fairfax a big one. So yeah, the media coverage was savage, and in one sense, they had some justification. A lot of people think the media is biased. Well, when you directly affect their lives and their careers, yes, they're not going to be that happy with you, and
Sure.
frankly, rightly so.
And like you said, there's some truth behind it, even if the message could be said a little gentler or whatever, right? You
Yeah,
were a 26-year-old
absolutely.
kid. You were probably being fairly headstrong. So, I heard you say, or I read somewhere that you said the financial loss was not the hardest part for you. And when you talked about it, I really got that. It was sort of like whatever, like that. And maybe it's because you that wasn't your goal really, but what was the hardest part for you?
Yeah, I mean, just in answering that, the goal really was, the company had been started by John Fairfax 150 years before, a tremendous leader. Employees loved him. He was a good dad, husband, friend. He founded some nonprofits. He did everything in life well. He was successful and significant, thriving in the best sense of the word. I mean, it really doesn't get any better than that. As I mentioned, person of strong faith, elder in his church. So in my mind, I wanted to bring the company back to the ideals of the founder, at least in terms of how people are treated. Independent journalism with a little less sensational. My parents and I felt like the company wasn't being well run. There was some capital raising scheme that was not too smart. There was another media company, the Herald and Weekly Times, that Murdoch and News Limited got most of, and we were sort of a day later dollar short, so to speak. They were just, in my mind and my parents, management were doing some things we thought was suboptimal, as they say, like a lot suboptimal. So
Sure.
there were reasons, reasonably valid reasons, but was the cure worse than the disease? And was I the one? I brought in new management, and yes, they increased operating profits 80%, but the debt was so high that despite numerous refinancings in late 1990, when Australia got in a recession, significant recession, the company, it went bankrupt. And so, yes, notionally, I suppose it was like a $2 billion loss, but growing up with a lot of money and influence, if you will, and respect, we had all of those things because the Fairfax family were respected by all parties, communities. So what more is there to life?
Mm-hmm.
Money, status, respect. Very few people have, some people have money and status, but maybe not respect. We had all of those things.
And yet
Sort of
you
like
didn't
being a,
feel, and yet you weren't feeling fulfilled by that.
no. And so when the company went under, yes, it wasn't so much the financial loss. I mean, I didn't have billions, but I had enough to, rent a place, and we were fine. My wife's American. So we moved into the US in the early 90s, had a young family in the 90s. But yeah, the worst part of the loss was this sense that I let down my father, my parents, my ancestors. There were 4,000 plus employees. Yes, they may have had jobs, or at least many of them, but they preferred to work for the Fairfax family. There was a feeling that that's a safe place
Mm-hmm.
because they knew they could practice independent journalism. We weren't going to do, as some do, favors for mates. Oh, here's a mate and he's my buddy and prime minister, therefore we'll do him a favor. We never did that,
Mm-hmm.
ever. So just, and causing friction within my family. Yes, they might have existed for decades, but certainly what I did didn't help. So feeling like I let my dad down, my parents, caused instability within the family and with employees at the company. And in some strange cosmic way, because I'm also a person of faith, I felt and this is going to sound pretty weird, but maybe God had a plan to have it run, at least in terms of the ideals of the founder, treating people with respect and all, and have it be well run. And somehow I felt like I blew some cosmic divine plan. So poor theology, but as a person of faith, it got to the most important thing in my life. So that was the single most crippling thing. Whenever you have a loss that cuts to the heart of who you are as a person and everything you value and believe in one sense, that is the ultimate loss, because it cuts against your values. You feel like you've let down everything you believe in, everything that you
Absolutely.
like to think makes you who you are. So that was yeah, the 90s were very hard. I wasn't clinically depressed, but I was very down. I'm not somebody that blames other people. My default is, if there's a problem in the world, it's my fault. So I was not blaming. Look, I could have said, yes, there's instability, and look what they did to my dad in 76. I could have gone down a laundry list. Oh, it was justified because the company wasn't being well run. And yes, we increased operating profits 80%. I could have written my balance sheet of
Right.
why I did what I did. But no, I was just more, I graduated with a Harvard MBA in like June 87, a few months before the takeover. I was like, how could I have been so dumb? Wasn't I listening? I
Right.
mean, in class, I would just, pretty much endless self-recrimination of just how could I have been so dumb? I never want to hurt anybody, but yet I've hurt a lot of people,
How long
so
did you stay
that was the
in
toughest
that
thing.
mind frame? Sorry, how long were you in that mind frame
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah. I mean, in that mindset, yeah, I would say certainly a good part of the 90s. It took a while for me to bounce back, but yeah, I mean, it was certainly a period of years. And even as I did begin to bounce back, it's not like those voices in your head ever completely go away. They become less, they become manageable, but it's like, dealing with grief and loss, it's not like it ever goes away. It becomes more manageable. But yeah, it
well,
took years
it's
for it to
so
be
weird, like you were saying,
manageable.
whenever we have something, I think that's you know, we have our identity, and then our identity creates kind of this blueprint of how we think our life should be going, right? And whenever we get too far off track with that, it can be as simple as why you stay within the weight range that you do, right? But what you're talking about here is like everything that you stand for, everything that you were born into, everything that. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing. When I heard your story, and this one sounds so much smaller in a way, but I think it had the same emotional impact. Is we didn't grow up with a lot of money at all, and I kind of made money my God. I was like, well, I'm going to get rich, um, period. By the time I'm 35, I'll be a multimillionaire and all of this. And by God, it kind of happened, without a college education or anything. Went out there, did all the work, did all the stuff, kept chasing it though. I was just chasing it, chasing it, chasing it. And I sold a company to a Fortune 500 company in the late 90s and did pretty well with it. And again, a couple of decimal points off where you guys were, but still, it was significant, for a kid that came up from a
Yeah.
kind of lower middle class background. And I took all that money in the late 90s and decided I was great at stocks, because why not? Like everybody was great with stocks in 1999. And
Sure.
what's that saying? They say, a fool and his money are soon to be parted, or something like that, whatever that
Yeah,
phrase is.
yeah,
And it
indeed.
definitely applied. Like it was, I ran it up until it ended. You know what I mean? It was, I took the deal money, became a millionaire, more than doubled that. And then all of a sudden it all just came crashing down. And I had based my entire blueprint, my entire way of life almost in net and self-worth. I heard Nick say in his podcast, when your self-worth is tied to your net worth, you've got, I think that was in Nick's podcast, but you know,
Yeah.
that mine was directly tied to that. And so it took me years to really come back from that, where I'd constantly be like, things that I would say to myself, like, oh, I never really deserved it anyway, or I don't belong in this, with this class of people. I grew up this way. That's probably should probably stay in my lane, right? And I started really kind of playing small. And so when I heard your story, and not only is the story to me is inspiring. It's not a
Mhm.
disaster at all. It's inspiring because you've taken it to help other people like me to go, hey, you pivot out of this, help other people. even when you said the $2.25 billion is not the loss of the story, and I'm like, whoa, that's
Mhm.
pretty profound, right? So what did you learn about yourself from that time frame, from that initial time frame of it, I guess, between when it went bankrupt and when you
Mhm.
started pulling out in, sounds like, the late 90s, early 2000s? What did you learn during that time?
Well, I learned a lot, which is I'm basically a reflective advisor. I like to think I'm a reasonable writer. I'm curious. I'm a certified International Coach Federation executive coach, which we'll get into later. I now have our own podcast, Beyond the Crucible, where we interview folks about their worst days and how do they bounce back, find significance, which we define as a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. But basically, I realized, I'm not this, you know, big business corporate raider type. I don't like managing thousands of people. I'd rather listen, reflect, think, write, ask questions. So it was just a terrible fit for my wiring. I don't necessarily like being in front of, certainly back then, thousands of people or in the limelight. And at the time, money was never something that was attractive to me, because when you grow up with about as much money and power as you can, and we had politicians, business folks. My mother was, which is a whole other story, a larger than life, outgoing person. She could have parties for 300 like it was nothing. Very determined uh, person. So, people from Hollywood would come out when they were going to Australia, and their friends would say, Lady Mary Fairfax will throw you a party, but in a level that you may not be familiar with in Hollywood. And it's not so much because of the money or the grandiosity, but more the style, just the whole way of being. So, I mean, in that sense, I saw plenty of people. They may have had money, but they really weren't happy. I didn't
Right.
think. By and large, they had messed up kids, and they were bragging to each other about the deal or the latest exotic place they went to, or yeah, they met Princess so and so in Milan, or whatever it is. It's just the way it goes. It's like, I guess that whole thing, it was just so unattractive to me. So money wasn't really the issue, but I had my whole identity in being a Fairfax, not
Mhm.
so much because of the status, but the sense of what it could do to the country of Australia. And so in that sense, that's where my identity was. And so coming back from that is, well, I had a chance to do a massive amount of good for my country. And now at like age 30, I blew it. I will never be in a position to do that much good to that many people ever. And I suppose objectively, I suppose that's maybe true on one level, but yeah, that was sort of the identity issue for me. And as I came back, I guess there were a few things that helped me come back. One is, whenever you go through a crucible, which we define as like a devastating setback or failure that fundamentally transforms your life. There's before the crucible and there's after the crucible. It's searingly painful. Um, and it just, as a side note, you have a choice. You can say, this was unfair, what was done to me, or what I did was so stupid or terrible, and hide under the covers, and eventually after 30, 40, 50 years, life will end. Or you can say, this was awful, or what I did was stupid, but how do I bounce back out of this and use this to maybe serve others? So for me, I kind of, from my faith perspective, realized, if God had wanted this to happen, or the universe, whoever, it would have. But I believe, from my faith perspective, God loves us all unconditionally. We don't need to earn his love. And so I clung to my faith, looked at it a bit differently. My wife, who'd been married over 30 years, was very supportive. Unconditional love of a partner or spouse is massive. Had young kids. And I began to find meaningful work step by step, that gradually my self-esteem clawed up its way back. I mean, started with a aviation services company in Maryland where I lived, doing business and financial analysis. This was just pre-internet, so they didn't really know who I was. Fortunately, uh, got into executive coaching, went to a woman that did mid-career assessment. She said I had a good profile for that. I got on a couple of nonprofit boards, including being an elder at a non-denominational church. Um, I began to realize I had a leadership voice through the questions I was asking. And probably the pivotal moment that launched what I do in Crucible Leadership happened when in 2008, my pastor asked me to give a brief talk in church about what I went through and lessons learned. And somehow, certainly not back then, probably not today, being as charismatic speaker, somehow weeks and months after, people said, what you shared, Warwick, really helped me. And I'm thinking, how many people are like a former media moguls that have lost $2 billion? I've never met anybody like me. It's a self-help
Right,
group of one, you know?
right,
It,
right.
it's it's very lonely in that sense. But yet somehow by being honest about my failure and kind of what I learned. So at that point, I thought, if I can write a book about what I'd learned and what I'd been through, and if that helps people, it's worth the pain of writing. And it was never going to be, oh, I'm right, they're wrong, the typical autobiography. That's just not my philosophy. So that was pivotal that launched my book and then everything else I'm doing. And I guess the final thing I'll say is um, when you use your pain for a purpose and you use it to help others, it is like drops of grace. It does reduce the pain. It does increase the fulfillment. It does increase your sense of thriving. So it's yeah, you use your skills and your story and your pain in service of others. Yeah, you can be successful, but you can be more than successful. You can actually feel fulfilled.
Yeah, well, I
A lot
think
of people
when
that
you're
are
in
successful that aren't fulfilled.
totally, and I think when you're contributing to someone else, right? When you're truly in service to someone else, it is very hard to feel self-pity at the same time as expressing genuine contribution to somebody at the same time, right? So it just kind of takes you out of, I think, your own situation, aside from the very real part of like you are doing something productive, you are building something cool, you are making a difference in someone's life. But just the emotion in that, we try to talk to people sometimes about the quickest way for someone, and I'm not talking about if they're clinically or chemically
Sure.
need help, but to snap out of a certain state is to go and be of service, is to contribute, right? Is to go and help out. And so that's very, very cool. And so that was another kind of pivotal moment for you then, was when your pastor asked you to speak. Did that
Mm.
become, so you said, I mean, you kind of went quickly through that, eventually ended up writing, but was it truly like in
Sure.
that moment you knew like, okay, this is my purpose now?
It's interesting. One of the things we talk a lot about is vision. And
Mhm.
most people who are strategists or business folks want the 10-year, 20-year vision with Gantt charts and milestones. And life's not like that.
Yeah.
So, you know, vision evolves.
Yeah.
It's funny, one of the things I talk about in the book, and, everybody thinks of Walt Disney and Walt Disney World and, the movies. He just started in the 20s and early 30s with a very simple concept. I think cartoons can be done better. I think there's a better way, a better story with cartoons. And he started with Mickey Mouse, and he didn't have this big vision of changing the world. He just
Right.
think, I think we can do better. And then gradually the vision grew. So I think vision is a lot like this. So for me, at that point, I thought, okay, I want to write a book about my story. And it was talked about my story, my dad, lessons from my dad and John Fairfax, my great great grandfather, lessons from historical and inspirational faith leaders. But the core of it is really my story and what I learned, and how you bounce back from your worst day. Well, that took years to write, because imagine writing about your most painful time in life. After a couple hours a day, I was done. It was just so painful, so I had to take a break. So it took years to write, and then it took years to get it published. Initially, I thought, oh, surely to goodness people in Australia would want to publish it because my name is well known. Fairfax Media, iconic institution. And some were like, this is an interesting story. It's a little old. It's a few decades old, but we might consider it if you write a tell-all book, trashing family and other members. Like, no, not,
Right.
I will not do that. It was against my value system. So I didn't do that. One said, well, it's interesting, but you need a brand. Okay, I have a Harvard MBA. I understand the concept of you need a brand and you need a following and you need an email list and social media following. So gradually I grew that, found a great branding and marketing firm and grew my social media following. And then it evolved. Gosh, one good way to get the message out will be to have a podcast. Okay, I like asking questions. I think I can do that. And so, we started doing that with Beyond the Crucible. We're now like, I don't know, 140 episodes in, and maybe like 100,000 total downloads or something, which does bigger, but it's not bad,
Sure.
and so we're moving ahead. So the point about it is the vision grew. We have blogs and assessments and e-course and all, but the vision started with, I want to write a book about my story to help people. That was the vision at the time, and then it evolved and grew over the years since 2008. So I think vision is like that. Start with something you think is based on your fundamental wiring, something you're off the charts passionate about, the ties to your beliefs and values, whatever that may be, and make a beginning. You may not know where it's going to go, but trust yourself, trust your gut, surround yourself with some good people, and it'll work out. But
Yeah, well, it seemed like it was a journey, a little bit of faith, right? Of like, hey, I think I'm on the
exactly.
right track here, and
Yeah,
I may not have all the answers, but this seems to be almost a guided kind of place to go down, right? It feels
sure,
good. It's helping other people.
sure.
How does faith play a part in kind of this rebuilding of you?
I think, I'm pretty clear in my book about my own, Christ-centered evangelical faith. I think I'd say most people today, we are not religious, they would be spiritual, is the way most surveys would say. And so I
Mhm.
think, especially young people today. So really what's important is not what other people think or believe, but we all believe and have values in something. So don't ignore your fundamental beliefs. Again, it's not about what your parents or your cousins or your brothers and sisters and friends, it's not so relevant, but what do you believe? And so understand those, and you want to operate in light of your beliefs. I know that sounds pretty obvious, but most business folks out there, they go so far, so fast. Maybe they have some vague idea of their wiring, but what do they believe? It's like, well, how's that relevant? Yeah, I'm trying to make, the
Right.
quarterly earnings per share number, and trying to meet my sales numbers. Well, it is relevant, because what often happens is, I wish I didn't have to say often, but I think it's true, is people are living out of line with their own beliefs and values. And when I've, been coaching folks, and I'll ask folks, so help me understand what you believe is your beliefs and values. To what degree you're operating out of line with those. And they might say, well, yeah, I think I actually, come to think of it, I am. And as a coach with a straight face, I'll say, well, do you think you should change your beliefs and values to better align with how you're living? Or should you change how you're living to better
Sure.
be in line with your values? I'm not judgmental here. Now, what sane person is going to say, yes, I need to change my values and beliefs to be in line with what I'm doing? Because
Right.
my whole lifestyle seems it's all about money. So I need to change that whole help humanity. And I need to change my beliefs, and it's all about number one and making money, and then I'll be good.
Right.
Well, no, you'll be insane. You'll be torn apart. So yeah, if you operate outside of your beliefs and values, that way lies madness, or at least a lot of pain,
Well, I think most of
with
us,
100% certainty.
totally. And I think most of us, we talked about it earlier, having, I overused probably that quote, success without fulfillment is the ultimate failure. And it's because of that. It's because I have all the stuff I was aiming for, the cars, the bank account, the business, whatever it is. And yet it still doesn't feel good because I've never actually taken the time, or never taken enough time to really figure out what I'm all about. And am I in alignment with that? And it's funny. There's a guy. I'm not going to name his name because I haven't asked him if it's okay or not. But there's a guy that I know in my old home state of Arizona, who, this guy's about my age, and all he does is teach yoga every day. He just teaches yoga. That's what he, and meditation. Literally, probably one of the happiest, most well balanced people I've ever met in my life. And I don't think I've ever told him this, but when I first met him, I kind of thought he was a loser. I mean, I just did. And that's not his fault.
Right,
That's mine. That's me just going, you
right.
should be
Yeah,
earning more money. You should be working
sure.
harder. You should be, on the go. Like, what are you just hanging out, playing your
Right.
guitar and teaching yoga and meditation? That's weird. And then as I started learning a little more about yoga and meditation, I was like, wow, that seems pretty cool, actually. Right. And maybe that's not exactly how I'm wired. Um, but the idea of seeing someone that like that was honestly and truly, I believe some people lean on that stuff as checking out from things
Sure.
they want to do. But for him, that was exactly where he needs to be. He's helping people. He's doing what he needs to do. He's happy doing it. He lives a fulfilled life. It doesn't fit my little graph of maybe where he should be. It doesn't really matter, you know?
But right, but yeah, he's using something he loves to help others. And one of the things is that a lot of things we can change, but there's certain fundamentals about humans that you can't change.
Right.
It's immutable. You can either accept it or reject it. And one of it is that success in of itself doesn't make humans happy. Whether it's God, the universe, we're not wired that way. The way to happiness is serving some higher purpose, whatever that means to you, and serving others. So it's like you might disagree with that philosophy. The problem is that's basic human wiring. You can't
Right.
alter your fundamental, almost spiritual, emotional, psychological DNA. So it's like, okay, I may agree or disagree, but it's a fact that if I
Right.
want to be happy and fulfilled, I'm going to have to think of others. It's just, you don't have any choice in them.
Right.
We have choices. This is a choice you don't have. There's
Right.
sadness and misery and fulfillment. You do have a choice which one you want. Let's say most sane people don't want misery and sadness if they can avoid it. And so that's where, success, it never satisfies. It's like there's never enough. You have a house in the Hamptons. Well, maybe your buddy has a house in the south of France. Okay, well, you got your house in the south of France, but gosh, a place in Aspen and Biarritz. I mean, it's never enough. You have
Right.
a nice car, a nice boat, or somebody else has a bigger one, a bigger plane. I mean, there's this notion, millionaires think they'd be happier if they're billionaires. Billionaires think they'd be happier if they're multi-billionaires. And
No, I
it's a fool's errand. It's never enough, you
I don't
know?
think I've ever talked about this before, but since we're on it, I get uncomfortable anytime someone asks me like, what is your legacy, right? Or what do you want your legacy to be? And I'm like,
Mhm.
because to me, don't get me wrong, I like to have
Sure,
nice things and I like to earn money and stuff, but
sure.
uh, I do not care at the end of it, as long as I haven't burdened my family with undue financial
Sure,
obligations. I don't really care what's left. And what I do care about, it sounds simple. It sounds almost like I'm
sure.
playing small, and I'm not. But I'm like, I care that I've raised amazing children, and our kids are grown now, and we can see that they are amazing adults. Right? They're some of the best people I know, and they're now having kids of their own. And I want to be a present, hands-on, energetic grandfather. To our grand. You know what I mean? And so I'm not.
Yeah.
So my legacy is that it's not. If my company happens to get sold for $50 million along the way, then that's a bonus to me. That's not the legacy. You know what I mean? That's almost like and trust me, I haven't always thought that way. I only have thought that way probably the last 10 years since I've gotten over those money wounds. But I but the question itself, I don't like what's your legacy? I feel like, well, my name on the library, I don't know. What does that question
Well,
mean, really,
yeah, it's a fascinating question. I never thought about it the way you're talking about it, but it can be a burden. But yeah, you're right. It's certainly not in terms of money. And people often think, and this is not an original thought, what's your eulogy going to be? What are your kids, spouse, friends going to be saying? I mean, yeah, that's something we tend to care about, but they won't be talking about, well, let's talk about how many companies Ken founded and his balance sheet.
Sure.
Nobody gives that eulogy. It'll be
Right.
like, he was a great dad, friend, spouse. He cared about people. He made a difference. Those are the things you want people to say. So I try not to get too hung up on, what's my legacy, but
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, um, you want to feel like you made a difference and you lived life the right way. You cared about your family, cared about your friends, and you made a contribution in some way. You can even get hung up because this this thing could be tricky. So it can be like, well, what does making a difference mean? Like for me, when I have my book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials, Life Significance, that came out October last year, October 2021. I was determined that I was not going to be measuring my self-worth based on the amount of copies. Is it going to be 10, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000? It's like, or yeah, I didn't mention earlier the amount of downloads. My self-worth is not going to be measured by the number of downloads in the podcast, or what kind of people I'm interviewing, or how many e-courses I have. You can, there's always room to get off the wagon and get into the success environment, even when you think what you're doing is fulfillment, and is, you know?
Right.
So I really try to almost like every day saying, you know what, and from my faith perspective, I believe that we're all loved because of who we are, not because of what we accomplish. I really try and live that mantra, if you will, every day, saying, yeah, I want to have a legacy of caring for people, but I try to refuse to get into, well, how big is that legacy?
Yeah,
How many
yeah.
people have you helped? Because then you can get spun up on that, right? You could say to yourself, Ken, well, I love what I'm doing with the Leaders Lab and this, but gosh, there are other people that are having a bigger impact than me, or this, that, and the other. It's easy to get off the wagon and into
Yeah.
the performance trap.
I feel
Even when you
like,
think you're living a life focused on others, there's
yeah,
always room to fall off the wagon.
totally. And I feel like where I'm getting it crossed up is the difference between, like, when you said eulogy, no problem, right? Eulogy, I'm
Right,
like, I know what people would say about me right now, and I feel good about
right,
that. You say
right.
legacy, I think of things. I think of bank accounts. I think of numbers or
And
digits or
maybe
decimals.
your
I don't know why.
name on the side of a hospital,
Yes, totally.
uh, that kind of thing. It's like, gosh, Ken's hospital, museum, donated by Ken. It's like,
Yeah,
really, is that, because
yeah.
that can get into all, hey, look at me,
Well,
I'm
and then
this
it's,
wonderful philanthropist,
well,
kind of deal.
exactly, because one of the things I noticed is, you talk about having a life of significance, right? And you talk a lot about, and significance sometimes in the personal development world sometimes gets a bad rap, because
Mhm.
significance for the wrong reasons is not a great thing, right? If I get significance by,
Yes.
I really need you guys to see me pull up in my Ferrari. I don't have one, by the way, but if I did, I really need you to see that, or my keychain's hanging out, or whoops, did I
Oh,
leave my stock market portfolio open, or whatever it is.
exactly,
And yeah,
exactly.
that's one form of
Or
significance. Another form, though,
yeah,
is how many people can I help? How much impact can I have? And so I think significance is important for all of us, but I think the vehicles that we
it is.
choose to get it are critical.
It is. And even if it's like, look at all the people I've helped. And, certainly a telltale sign is, how much do you want people to know that you've
Right,
helped them? Do you
right,
want your name on the hospital wing?
right,
You've donated X millions of dollars to found some path-breaking cancer ward. Terrific.
right,
But is the motivation so that people will know what a wonderful human being you are?
right, right.
The Ken Islick Foundation, it's like, look at me, I'm just such a good
Right.
guy. It's
I'll
like,
just do it under the Leaders Lab, and then I can quit.
yeah,
I'm just kidding.
motivation is everything. So I think you just gotta check yourself, have some good friends in your life, spouse, partner, and yeah, you can't get paranoid about this stuff, but you don't even want to have your life of significance own you, and you don't want to get significance. You don't want to base your whole self-worth based on how many people you can help. So it's a subtle thing, but
Yep.
you know,
I think
yeah.
I had a friend that I was talking to, and as we were talking about this topic, it's sort of like the difference, I think, is chasing it, like chasing
Mm-hmm.
significance versus being significant, right?
Yes,
And I think
yes,
what you're trying to teach people is how to be significant, not to chase it, just to have significance in your life through a meaningful life cost. So I know we only have a few minutes left, but I was
sure.
curious, in the work that you do, I feel like you've become kind of an expert then through your own
Mm.
experiences and through the skill sets that you've gained through that, in helping people pivot out of these crucible moments and finding their purpose. How do you get started in doing that? What's your first way of helping them kind of ground and then build from there?
Very often, like for the people that we've helped and on the podcast, very often their worst day, their crucible becomes a springboard to which they can help people. I remember one of our very first podcast guests, David Charbonnet was a Navy SEAL, like his dad in Southern California. He was paralyzed in a parachuting accident. And, he was, according to his dad, who was a Navy SEAL, as good a SEAL as there was, which you don't say unless, your dad being a fellow SEAL is not going to say that ever wasn't true. So yes, he went through times of depression and just, gosh, I can't do what I love to do. But then he ended up getting help at a clinic for vets in San Diego, and now he runs that clinic and has as good equipment in the nation to help, injured vets get maximum mobility. So there he found his purpose in the ashes of his crucible. That's a common story in the case of mine. My whole brand, if you will, of Crucible leadership is founded on my crucible, on my story and my pain. So I think often, you can use that pain literally for a purpose to help others. There's tremendous healing and fulfillment. So, if you've been through a crucible, and, we did a survey, and, thousands of people, I forget what, like maybe up to 7,000 people now, something like that. Maybe actually almost 9,000. And it says that more than 71% have been through an event so traumatic that it fundamentally altered the course of their lives. So the listeners out there, you've got an extremely high probability of going through a crucible. Loss, losing parents, loved ones, everybody goes through that. That's guaranteed crucible that will happen to you. So I think the crucibles are going to happen, but the way you pivot out of them is very often doesn't have to be using that pain for a purpose. And it's got to be in line with your wiring, whether you're artistic, mathematical, scientific, and it's got to be in line with your fundamental beliefs. What do I believe needs to change in the world? What do I believe needs good that needs to be upheld? So those are some of the elements. Vision often comes out of the ashes of a crucible. It's got to be in line with your wiring and fundamental beliefs. So those are the building blocks. And I guess the last thing I'd say is you're not going to be able to map out a 10 or 20-year vision. I certainly didn't. But what's one first step? What's one baby step that I can start in my gut to the core of my being? I feel like I think this is the right step. I think it's worth a shot. And one step begets another step, begets another step, and a flywheel of hope, starts to form. So yeah, I think
Yeah, and I
that's
think in that flywheel, thank you for that. And I think in that flywheel, then it can become just asking yourself questions like, what's the next best thing, the next right thing?
right.
What not only feels right, but it's in alignment, right? I'm staying aligned with who I am, what my mission is, and what are the steps I can take towards that. So that's amazing. Well, I really, really appreciate you being on with us today. I have learned so much from you. And I got to tell you, the thing that I feel is not as prevalent as it needs to be in leadership is absolute vulnerability. And Brene Brown talks about it a lot. I think it's becoming a little more prevalent, especially from the better gender, from women, I think are bringing more vulnerability into the workplace. But I feel like men, we're very wired to not talk about our failures. We're very wired to, typical story, again, not a whole lot of media empires that people can talk about. Like you said, it might be a peer group of one, but anything similar to what you did, a lot of times it would have been the tell-all story. It would have been, yeah, but I'm back on my feet now and I'm still doing this and that. And it would be like, let's hide the failure. Let's talk about the wins. And I've learned so much from you just from your vulnerability and for sharing what you've shared. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here, Cam.
All right, sir. Have a great weekend. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Oops, I didn't mean to. Sorry, hold on. Hold on.